Iron Widow, my mother chuckled, tilting her glass toward the donors. I told her it's just the name of the black paint they slap on an Apache's gun to hide the rust. The ballroom erupted in mockery. I stood silent, the insane youngest daughter. Then Admiral Vance stood. Iron Widow isn't paint, Gisaine. It's the only reason your son came home in one piece. The room froze. Her smile died. I didn't stay for the silence. I had already signaled my transport. The engine's vibration was the only thing keeping me steady as we crossed the city limits back toward the Fairchild estate. The humidity of a Houston morning always feels like a damp wool blanket, heavy and suffocating. As the military transport pulled away from the iron gates of the Fairchild Manor, the silence that followed was louder than the roar of the Humvee's engine. I stood there, my boots crunching on the familiar white gravel, staring at the towering oak doors. I've faced insurgent ambushes in valleys where the sun never reached the bottom, but standing on this driveway, I felt a different kind of chill. My home, the place that should have been my sanctuary, looked like a fortress designed to keep me out. I adjusted the strap of my tactical bag, feeling the weight of the secrets I carried. My father used to tell me that true strength isn't found in the absence of pain, but in the steady hand that carries it. I repeated those words like a mantra. I wasn't here for an apology. I was here for the truth. I chose to walk toward that front door with grace. Resentment is a poison you drink hoping the other person dies, and I had seen enough death to know better. The heavy door groaned as I pushed it open. The scent of lemon polish and expensive lilies hit me instantly, the smell of a life I'd traded for gunpowder and desert sand. Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper who had been more of a mother to me than my own, stood in the foyer. Her eyes widened, shimmering with a mix of joy and terror. I stepped forward and offered a brief, firm touch to her hand. Her skin felt like parchment, trembling under my grip. "Calantha," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You're actually here." "I'm here, Mrs. Gable," I replied softly. I wanted her to know that despite the Iron Widow moniker the world had given me, the girl who used to steal cookies from her kitchen was still alive inside this uniform. I looked up. Gisaine Fairchild was standing at the top of the grand staircase. She didn't move. She didn't descend to embrace the daughter she hadn't seen in 2 years. She just stood there, her silhouette sharp and unforgiving against the stained glass window behind her. She looked down at me, not as a child returned from war, but as an unwanted guest who had tracked mud onto her pristine white carpet. The power dynamic was set before a single word was exchanged. "The library, Calantha," my mother said, her voice like a sheet of ice cracking. "Now." The library was exactly as I remembered, mahogany shelves stretching to the ceiling, filled with books no one in this house actually read. But today, the air was thick with the sterile scent of antiseptic. Casey was there, sitting at my father's old desk. My oldest sister looked every bit the prestigious surgeon she was, her lab coat draped over the chair, a stack of clinical folders spread out before her like a deck of tarot cards. "Sit down," Casey said, not looking up from her papers. I didn't sit. I stood by the window, watching the gray clouds roll in over the estate. I prefer to stand. Old habits. Gisaine walked in, closing the double doors behind her with a definitive thud. The room felt suddenly claustrophobic. Casey finally looked up, pushing a thick document toward me. It was stamped with the seal of a top-tier psychiatric clinic. "We've reviewed your military files, Calantha," Casey began, her tone clinical and devoid of warmth. Or at least the parts we could get our hands on. The psychotic breaks, the severe PTSD. The records describe a woman who is a danger to herself and others. This evaluation confirms you are legally incompetent to manage your own affairs. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I picked up the folder and flipped through the pages. My mind, trained to spot inconsistencies in enemy intelligence, moved with surgical precision. I saw the forged signatures. I noticed the dates that didn't align with my deployment schedule. They were trying to bypass the Texas probate code by using a fast-track emergency filing. They wanted my power of attorney. They wanted to erase the soldier and replace her with a broken girl they could control. I understand you believe you are protecting the family image, I said, my voice steady and low. But remember, the truth is like the sun. You can shut it out for a while, but it isn't going anywhere. It'll just burn hotter when it finally breaks through. Casey's face hardened. She exchanged a glance with our mother, a silent signal that the gloves were coming off. It's already done, Calantha, Casey said, her voice dropping the facade of sisterly concern. We filed a temporary guardianship petition with the court this morning. Your personal bank accounts are frozen. Your legal right to protest any decisions regarding the Fairchild estate or the upcoming gala has been suspended. This was the opening move of their gambit. They had stripped me of my finances and my legal voice in one coordinated strike. They thought they had trapped me in a corner. But as I stood there, I wasn't looking at the documents. I was surveying the room. I noticed the subtle misalignment of the portrait of my father on the far wall. The hidden safe was still there. My mission had just shifted. I had to survive this den of vipers and protect the legacy my father had died to keep out of their hands. Gisaine stepped closer, her perfume cloying and suffocating. You should have stayed in the desert, Calantha. You don't belong in a world of fine silk and reputation. You're a broken tool, and we are just putting you back in the box where you belong. I looked at her, truly looked at her. I saw the way her hand trembled as she reached for her tea. I saw the desperation in the lines around her eyes. She wasn't a queen. She was a terrified woman watching her empire of debt crumble, clawing at her own daughter to stay afloat. I felt a sudden, profound wave of pity. It's a tragedy when a parent views their child as a life raft instead of a human being. I'm sorry you're so afraid, Mother, I said quietly. She recoiled as if I'd slapped her. I stood up, adjusting my jacket with the same military precision I'd used before every mission. They had stolen my voice in the courthouse, but they hadn't realized I was the one controlling the signal. They were playing checkers in a house where I'd already mapped the mines. I turned and walked toward the door. 2 private security guards were waiting in the hallway, their faces grim. Take her to her room, Gisaine commanded from behind me. She is to be monitored at all times. No phones, no outside contact. As I was escorted down the long, shadowed hallway of my youth, I leaned my head back and closed my eyes for a second. I felt the familiar hum of the mission beginning. Under my breath, too quiet for the guards to hear, I whispered the first activation code of the Iron Widow protocol. I walked into my bedroom and heard the heavy click of the lock turning from the outside. I went straight to the window, my fingers tracing the cold, hidden metal of the transmitter I'd stashed behind the radiator years ago. The Admiral would be in Houston by nightfall. The moonlight sliced through the heavy velvet curtains, casting long, jagged shadows across my childhood bedroom. I stood by the radiator, the metal biting into my palms as I listened to the house breathe, the groans of ancient wood and the distant, rhythmic footsteps of the guards in the hallway. I wasn't a daughter returning home. I was a high-value asset in a hostile environment. The lock on my door clicked, a sharp, metallic sound that echoed in the silence. Casey entered, her white lab coat gleaming like a shroud in the dim light. She held a tray with a single syringe, the needle catching the glint of the moon. This was the clinical face of betrayal. A sister using her oath of healing as a weapon of control. It's for the anxiety, Calantha, Casey said, her voice devoid of its former warmth. Mother wants you calm for the gala. We can't have any episodes in front of the investors. I didn't resist. I sat on the edge of the bed and rolled up my sleeve. As the needle pierced my skin, I initiated the metabolic suppression techniques I'd mastered during Tier 1 survival training. I focused on slowing my heart rate, forcing my body to absorb the sedative at a fraction of the normal speed. I feigned a heavy blink, letting my head loll slightly to give her the victory she craved. I looked at the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she capped the needle. You were a healer once, Casey, I whispered, my voice thick with staged drowsiness. Don't let the weight of this family turn your hands into shackles. I still remember when you used to fix my scrapped knees in the garden. She flinched, a flicker of the old Casey appearing for a fraction of a second before the mask of the Fairchild doctor snapped back into place. She left without a word, the door locking behind her once more. I waited for the sound of her footsteps to fade before I sat upright, the drug a mere hum in my system rather than a sedative. The most dangerous person is not the one who has nothing to lose, but the one who has found something worth fighting for again. An hour later, the door opened again. This time, it was Gisaine. She didn't come with medicine. She came with a costume. Behind her, 2 maids carried a bespoke, high-collared silk gown in a shade of black so deep it seemed to swallow the light. On a velvet cushion lay a choker, an ornate piece of platinum and onyx that looked more like a restraint than jewelry. "You will wear this tomorrow," my mother commanded, her eyes scanning my room with a predatory coldness. "It has been specifically designed to ensure you remain compliant." I ran my fingers over the cold metal of the choker. I felt the familiar weight of a micro GPS tracker and the subtle ridge of a remote-activated electric pulse. It was a silk cage. Under the temporary guardianship Casey had helped establish, my mother now had the legal right to monitor my movements for my own safety. The gala wasn't a celebration, it was a public execution of my autonomy. I stood still as they fastened the gown, mentally mapping the circuitry of the device against my throat. I recognized the manufacturer, a private security contractor my unit had investigated for human rights violations in the Middle East. My mother was using the tools of war to win a battle of social standing. I looked into the mirror, catching Gisaine's reflection. She was smiling, but her eyes were frantic, darting toward the window every time a car passed. She was more of a prisoner to her own greed than I was to this collar. "Mother," I said, my voice echoing in the small room. "You can lock my body in silk and metal, but my soul was never yours to own. You're trying to sell a ghost." "Be silent, Calantha," she snapped, her face twisting. "You'll play your part, or the courts will ensure you never see the sun again." When the room finally went dark and the house fell into a tomb-like silence, I moved. I crawled to the corner of the room, pulling back the loose floorboard beneath an old, faded photo of my father. My fingers found the small, hollow space he'd shown me when I was 10. Inside sat a micro SD card, stained with a single dried drop of blood, and a note written in his hurried, elegant scrawl. I read the words by the light of my small tactical penlight. The air seemed to leave my lungs. My father hadn't died in an accident. He had been murdered by the very people now standing in my foyer, all for the sake of his black gold encryption algorithm. The note was clear. The call sign, Iron Widow, wasn't just a name given to me by the Navy. It was the 256-bit encryption key to a multi-billion-dollar legacy he had hidden to protect me. The paint-on-a-gun joke they loved to tell wasn't just an insult. It was the ultimate irony. I was the key to the empire they were so desperately trying to steal. The mission was no longer about survival. It was about justice for the man who had seen the darkness in this house long before I did. I took the micro SD card and hid it in the hollowed-out heel of my boot, my eyes fixed on the moon hanging over the Houston skyline. The drugs were gone. The fear was gone. Only the mission remained. A sharp, rhythmic tapping sounded against the glass of my window. 3 short, 2 long. It was the coded signal of a Navy SEAL dialect I'd heard in the mountains of the Hindu Kush. Silas Vance was in position. The Iron Widow was no longer alone in the dark. The rhythmic tapping on the glass had been the last heartbeat of my old life. Now, as I stood before the gilded mirrors of the Post Oak Hotel, I was a stranger to the woman staring back. The black silk gown clung to me like liquid shadow, and the platinum choker felt like a cold, iron hand perpetually tightening around my throat. I smoothed the fabric over my ribs, feeling the faint, reassuring weight of the microtransmitter hidden in the hem. Vance was out there. The hunt had begun. Entering the grand crystal ballroom was like stepping into a beautiful, air-conditioned hell. The air was a thick, cloying mixture of white lilies and the metallic tang of expensive perfume. Gisaine held my arm with a grip that would have made a vice jealous, her fingernails digging into my skin through the silk. I didn't look at the crystal chandeliers or the ice sculptures melting under the heat of 1,000 vanity bulbs. I saw the exits. I mapped the security detail. I watched the dead eyes of the Houston socialites as they sipped champagne paid for with my father's stolen legacy. A sharp, stinging heat flared against my neck. I didn't flinch. I knew it was Gisaine testing the remote from the clutch bag hanging at her side. It was a silent, electrical reminder that my voice was currently on lease to the Fairchild name. I let my gaze drift across the room, my mind working like a tactical computer. Justice is not a destination you reach. It's a fire you must keep burning, even when the wind tries to blow it out. Near the catering entrance, an elderly busboy carrying a heavy silver tray stumbled, his knees buckling under the weight of a dozen crystal flutes. The socialites nearby stepped back, clutching their skirts to avoid the potential spill, their faces twisted in disgust. I broke away from Gisaine's grip before she could react. I reached out, my hand steadying the old man's arm with a strength that didn't match my slender frame. I noticed the faded, screaming eagle tattoo on his forearm. 101st Airborne. "Steady, brother," I whispered into his ear, using the low, guttural tone of the teams. "I've got your 6. The man's eyes cleared, a flash of recognition and profound gratitude crossing his weathered face. He nodded once, a soldier's silent salute. I stepped back into Gisaine's shadow as she hissed a reprimand about lowering myself to the staff, but I didn't care. That small act of kindness was a reminder that even in this den of vipers, my heart was still intact. Calantha Fairchild hadn't been erased. She was just waiting for the right moment to strike. "Calantha, stop drifting," Jody whispered, gliding toward us with a glass of vintage Bordeaux. She looked at me with a smirk that was as sharp as a scalpel. "You look stunningly obedient tonight. It's a good look for someone with your history." Jody began to brag about her new security app, a digital fortress she claimed would revolutionize corporate Houston. I listened to her explain the encryption layers, hiding my inner smile. She had no idea that I had bypassed its military-grade predecessor 3 hours ago from a burner laptop in the servants' quarters. To her, I was just the mute little sister, broke and broken. She leaned in closer, her breath smelling of grapes and arrogance. "Money is the only language people listen to here, little sister," Jody hissed. "And right now, you're just a silent debt we're about to settle." I watched the investor my mother was courting across the room. I recognized the way he stood, the subtle tilt of his head. He was linked to the same shadow organizations my SEAL unit had tracked across 3 continents. My mother thought she was saving the family. She didn't realize she was inviting a wolf to the table. The charity being celebrated tonight was nothing more than a front for a massive offshore tax evasion scheme. I saw the shell companies in my mind, the legal loopholes they thought were impenetrable. I intended to dismantle them brick by brick. The lights in the ballroom dimmed, and a single blinding spotlight cut through the darkness, centering on the stage. Gisaine stepped into the glow, her diamonds refracting the light like shards of broken glass. The room fell into an expectant, hungry silence. "Tonight is about legacy," Gisaine announced, her voice projected with practiced grace, "and about ensuring the Fairchild future is secured through a very special partnership." I felt the air leave the room. This wasn't a partnership. It was an auction. Under the guise of a conservatorship for her mental health, my mother was announcing a marriage merger. She was selling my legal guardianship and my father's remaining shares to Silas Sterling, a man whose reputation for domestic brutality was as well known as his bank account. She was trading my life for a $500 million infusion to hide her crimes. I looked at the bidders in the front row. I saw the greed, the entitlement, the way they looked at me as if I were a thoroughbred horse up for trade. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for my father's money or my own freedom. I was fighting for every person who has been silenced by a system that values profit over human dignity. As Sterling stepped forward into the light to claim his prize, his hand reaching out for mine, I caught a glimpse of movement near the back of the hall. A man stood by the marble pillar, his posture unmistakable. On his lapel, a small gold Navy SEAL pin caught the light. Silas Vance was in position. Sterling's fingers brushed my skin, cold and possessive. I didn't pull away. Instead, I felt my fingers subtly twitch toward the hidden trigger stitched into the silk of my gown, my eyes locking onto the Admiral's. Have you ever felt the weight of 1,000 eyes and realized none of them saw who you truly were? Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest weapon you possess. They thought they were buying a broken girl. They were about to find out they'd invited the Iron Widow to her own execution. The blinding glare of the spotlights felt like a physical weight against my eyelids. I stood at the center of the grand crystal ballroom, the ozone from the heavy stage lighting thick in my throat. Silas Sterling's hand reached for my arm, his fingers closing around my bicep like cold, unyielding iron. He didn't just touch me, he staked a claim. I didn't flinch. My SEAL training kicked into an automatic, detached clarity, separating the sensation of the predator's grip from the strategic necessity of the moment. I was no longer a daughter. I was a witness to my own sale. Beside me, Gisaine Fairchild beamed with a smile that was all teeth and zero soul. She stood tall, radiating the triumphant energy of a woman who had successfully pawned her youngest child to erase a mountain of fraudulent debt. She looked at the crowd of Houston's elite as if she had just performed a miracle. In the front row, Jody leaned back, her smartphone held high to record my public surrender. Her smirk was a jagged blade, cutting through the thin veneer of sisterly affection she had worn for years. I subtly adjusted my posture, ensuring the silk-cage choker sat high and clear on my neck, perfectly positioned for the hidden camera I'd arranged with the press. A person's character is like a tree, and their reputation is like its shadow. The shadow in this ballroom was warped, twisted by the lies of the people I shared blood with. I watched Sterling's possessive gaze and felt a strange, icy calm. They were all staring at the shadow, convinced it was the reality. I whispered a vow into the silence of my own mind. The shadow may look distorted in this light, Mother, but the tree is still standing. Gisaine stepped toward the microphone, the feedback a sharp whine that made the socialites wince. She paused for dramatic effect, her hand resting affectionately, mockingly, on my shoulder. "My Calantha has always loved to play the hero," Gisaine began, her voice dripping with a calculated, patronizing sweetness. She came back from her secretive service with all these stories. She even insists on a call sign. She calls herself Iron Widow. It sounds so dramatic, so cinematic, doesn't it? She paused, letting a small, condescending chuckle escape. Then came the strike. "But actually, ladies and gentlemen," Gisaine continued, looking directly at the billionaire bidders, "it's just the name of a cheap black paint used to coat Apache machine guns to hide rust. It's a thin layer used to cover cracks and wear. Like our beloved Calantha, the name is just a shell for something that has been through too much pressure." The ballroom didn't just laugh, it erupted. It was a sophisticated, cruel sound, the tittering of people who felt superior to the insane girl who thought she was a warrior. I felt the electric pulse of the platinum choker hum against my carotid artery, a sharp warning from the remote in Gisaine's hand. "Stay silent. Take the joke, be the paint." I absorbed the sting without a twitch, but my heart felt a profound, heavy pity for the woman beside me. She had forgotten that beneath the paint lay the steel that had kept her world from burning while she slept in silk. The sting of a mother's betrayal is a unique kind of heat. It doesn't just burn, it cauterizes the last remnants of hope. I looked at Casey, the prestigious surgeon, who was nodding in agreement from the wings. I looked at Jody, the tech mogul, who was laughing at the rust of my soul. They had spent years trying to convince me I was broken so they wouldn't have to admit they were the ones who were hollow. The lights began to flicker, a subtle, rhythmic pulse that most guests attributed to a minor power surge. I knew better. I looked past the diamonds and the lace, catching the eye of Admiral Silas Vance. He was standing near the shadows of the west exit, his face a mask of thunderous, suppressed fury. His hand hovered near his comms device, his eyes locked on mine, waiting for the green light that only I could give. I didn't give it yet. I offered my mother a small, sad smile, a final act of forgiveness for a woman who didn't realize she had already signed the warrant for her own social execution. Under the laws of this state, the conservatorship Sterling was clutching like a prize was a house of cards. Casey's fraudulent medical records were the foundation, and I had the digital trail to pull the bottom card. They thought they were using the law to bury me, but the law is a double-edged sword when you forget who actually forged the blade. I stepped back from Sterling, breaking his grip with a subtle, fluid movement he didn't even realize was a tactical evasion. The room grew colder as the HVAC system began to cycle into an emergency bypass I'd pre-programmed. I felt the hidden transmitter in my gown pulse against my skin. the widow's web was active. Have you ever stood in a room full of people laughing at you and felt a sudden, terrifying sense of peace? It's the moment you realize their opinions are just noise, and you are the one holding the volume knob. They were so busy mocking the paint that they never checked the caliber of the gun. "Is something wrong, darling?" Gisaine whispered, her voice tight with a warning as the lights dimmed further. "No, Mother," I replied, my voice finally breaking its long silence, clear and steady enough to carry over the fading laughter. "Everything is exactly where it needs to be." I reached out, my fingers touching the agate stones on the necklace. I knew the Admiral was moving. I knew the word widow was no longer an insult, but a promise. The billionaire reached out again to grab my wrist, his face darkening with displeasure at my sudden challenge. He couldn't touch me. The ballroom plunged into a total, absolute darkness that felt like a physical blow. The music stopped. The laughter died in 1,000 throats. In that suffocating blackness, the only sound was the heavy, synchronized thud of boots moving toward the stage. I haven't been forgotten. I've been erased. And now, I'm the only thing you'll see. The darkness wasn't an obstacle. It was an old friend. While the rest of the ballroom descended into a cacophony of shattered glass and high-pitched terror, my world became sharp, cold, and quiet. Silas Sterling's hand, which had been clutching my arm with such arrogant possession, suddenly tightened in panic. He tried to yank me toward the stage exit, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He thought he was saving his investment. He didn't know he was holding onto a hurricane. I focused on the steady thrum of my own pulse, the adrenaline washing away the last lingering fog of Casey's sedative. I executed a precise, rhythmic contraction of the trapezius and sternocleidomastoid muscles, a specialized Tier 1 technique designed for high-stress escape. The internal wiring of the silk-cage choker groaned, then snapped with a muffled metallic pop. The threat of the electric pulse died instantly. I was no longer a leashed animal. I was the Iron Widow, and the hunt had begun. In the flickering red glow of the emergency exit signs, I saw Gisaine stumble, her heels catching on the hem of her designer gown. I didn't run for the door. Despite everything, I reached out and caught her by the shoulder, pulling her behind a massive marble pillar as the first shadows of armed men moved across the ballroom floor. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a primal fear I had seen in 1,000 combat zones. "Stay low, Mother," I whispered, my voice a calm blade cutting through her hysteria. "Hate me later, but stay alive now. Don't move until I come for you." I didn't wait for her to understand. Forgiveness isn't about trusting the people who hurt you. It's about refusing to let their darkness dictate the boundaries of your light. I moved away from her, blending into the shadows as the heavy thud of tactical boots echoed against the polished floor. The situation had shifted. Jody's staged kidnappers, the mercenaries she had hired to frighten me into revealing my father's encryption code, had clearly decided to rewrite the script. The scent of ozone and gun oil filled the air as they began barking orders at the elite guests, their greed overriding their original contract. They were no longer actors in a Fairchild drama. They were predators in a room full of prey. I moved through the darkness like a ghost, a shadow among shadows. I didn't need a weapon to be lethal. I intercepted the first mercenary near the buffet line, his silhouette backlit by a glowing warming tray. I struck with bone-shattering efficiency, a palm strike to the solar plexus followed by a sweeping takedown that left him silent before he even hit the floor. One by one, I systematically neutralized the threat, protecting the very people who had laughed at my rust only minutes before. Near the center of the room, I found Jody cowering under a linen-draped table, her manicured hands white-knuckled around the conservatorship papers. She looked up and saw me, her face twisting in a mix of horror and disbelief as I took the documents from her hand. I didn't say a word. I simply shredded the thick vellum into 100 useless pieces, letting the fragments fall like snow over her expensive shoes. "You traded a sister for a contract, Jody," I said, my voice barely a whisper above the chaos. "You're about to find out that paper doesn't bleed, but it certainly burns." I heard a muffled whimper from the direction of the service pantry. A young waitress, no older than 20, was trapped behind a stack of crates, her eyes fixed on a mercenary patrol. I diverted my path, sliding through the darkness to her side. I didn't just move her. I ensured she was tucked into a reinforced secure closet, placing my hand over hers to steady the trembling. Even when you are built for war, you must never lose the instinct to protect the peace. The backup generators finally groaned to life, the ballroom flickering into a dim, dusty yellow light. Dust motes danced in the tactical beams of the fallen mercenaries' flashlights. I stood in the center of the wreckage, my gown torn at the hem, my breathing steady and rhythmic. I began gathering the discarded weapons, stacking them with a clinical military precision that spoke louder than any shout. I dragged the leader of the group, the man Jody had personally communicated with, to the center stage. I grabbed the wireless microphone from the podium and held it to his bruised lips. The sound system crackled, broadcasting his ragged confession to every corner of the room. He spoke the names, the Fairchild sisters. He detailed the plan for a forced confession. He revealed the rot that lay beneath the Fairchild silk. I looked at the terrified guests emerging from the shadows, their diamonds looking cheap and dull in the harsh emergency light. They looked at me, and for the first time they weren't seeing a broken girl or a layer of paint. They were seeing the steel. "The rust you saw tonight wasn't mine," I told the room, my voice echoing through the hollow silence. It was just a reflection of the people hosting this party. The steel has always been right here, standing between you and the dark. I reached up and wiped a smear of blood from my cheek with a discarded silk napkin. I felt the vibration of the floor beneath my boots, the heavy, synchronized approach of a Tier 1 extraction team. I looked toward the main entrance, my eyes locking onto the widening gap in the doors as the sirens of Houston began to wail in the distance. Have you ever seen the exact moment a lie dies? It's not loud. It's the silence that follows when the truth finally takes its seat at the table. My family tried to erase me, but all they did was sharpen the blade. A heavy boot thudded against the ballroom entrance, the wood splintering under the force. A voice like grinding gravel, a voice I had trusted in the darkest corners of the world, bellowed across the hall. "Nobody moves! This is a military lockdown! Secure the Iron Widow!" The smoke from the tactical strobes swirled around the marble pillars like a dying ghost. Through the haze, I saw my mother's face. The transition from terror to predatory calculation was instantaneous. As the first backup lights flickered to life, Gisaine didn't rush to see if I was hurt. She didn't offer a hand. Instead, she pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me, her voice shrill enough to cut through the remaining silence of the ballroom. "There she is!" Gisaine screamed, her eyes darting to the wealthy guests emerging from the shadows. "She did this! Her PTSD! She's unstable! She invited these men here to prove some twisted point. Look at her! She's dangerous!" Casey and Jody were at her side in a heartbeat, a wall of Fairchild blood united in a final, desperate act of gaslighting. Casey, clutching her medical bag, shouted for the hotel security to restrain me, her voice echoing with a clinical authority that had once commanded my respect. Jody added her own jagged notes to the chorus, claiming I had assaulted innocent security contractors, the very mercenaries she had hired to break me. They weren't just protecting their secrets anymore. They were trying to bury me alive under the weight of their lies. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I stood in the center of the debris, my silk gown torn and stained with the blood of the men I'd neutralized, but my spirit felt lighter than it had in years. The louder the storm, the more important it is to be the anchor. I looked at Gisaine, seeing her not as a formidable matriarch, but as a small, frightened woman drowning in her own illusions. "Mom," I said, the words sounding foreign even to my own ears. "You've spent so much time building walls to protect your reputation that you didn't notice you were building your own prison. Look around. The walls are gone." The double doors of the ballroom didn't just open. They were breached. The synchronized, rhythmic thud of heavy boots filled the hall, a sound that brought a sudden, absolute chill to the room. A squad of naval military police moved in with a precision that made the hotel's private security look like children playing at war. And then, he walked in. Admiral Vance moved through the wreckage with the authority of a man who owned the ground he stood upon. Gisaine rushed toward him, her face a mask of false relief, her hands outstretched to welcome him as a VIP savior. She began to weave a tale of how she had nearly been a victim of her insane daughter. Vance didn't even look at her. He didn't break stride. He walked straight past the matriarch of the Fairchild Empire as if she were a piece of discarded furniture. In front of the wealthiest families in Texas, the 3-star Admiral halted exactly 2 paces from me. He snapped his heels together, his back as straight as the steel he commanded, and offered a crisp, formal salute. The room froze. The silence was so heavy you could hear the distant crackle of the emergency strobes. "Iron Widow!" Vance's voice bellowed, vibrating in the very foundation of the Post Oak Hotel. "The threat to the national security data has been neutralized. I am here under the authority of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to extract you and to execute the warrants on those who compromised your mission and the safety of this sovereign territory." He turned his gaze toward the crowd, his eyes like flint. For 7 years, this woman operated in the shadows. She saved 200 lives in the Korangal Valley. She stayed behind so your sons and daughters could come home. The paint you heard mocked tonight was the only thing standing between the dark and the world you enjoy. The shock was a physical presence in the room. I saw Casey's medical bag slip from her hand, hitting the floor with a hollow thud. Jody's smirk had vanished, replaced by a gray, ashen terror. The legal reversal was swift and absolute. Vance's legal team stepped forward, presenting federal court orders that immediately voided the fraudulent guardianship Casey had filed. Under the weight of federal military protection and the evidence I had secured, I was legally reinstated as the sole executor of my father's estate. I approached my mother one last time. I didn't yell. I didn't hit her. I reached out and gently straightened the diamond necklace that had slipped during her panic. "You taught me that image is everything, Mother," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Tonight, the world finally saw the real you. I forgive you for what you tried to do to me, but I can no longer protect you from yourself. Justice is not about making people suffer. It's about making them face the truth they tried so hard to bury." Gisaine didn't answer. She couldn't. Her empire of cards had collapsed, leaving her standing in the ruins of a reputation she had sold her soul to maintain. The clinking of handcuffs behind me was the only music left in the ballroom. I reached into the hidden pocket of my gown and pulled out the blood-stained micro SD card, my father's legacy, his final message, and the key to a future they would never touch. I handed it to Vance, my duty to my father finally aligning with my duty to my country. I looked at Silas and gestured toward the giant projector screen at the head of the ballroom. A small, cold smile touched my lips. "But wait, Silas!" I said, my voice echoing through the silent hall. "There's one more layer to the paint they haven't seen yet." The high-contrast light from the massive overhead projectors cut through the ballroom's lingering haze like a surgical strike. As the screens flickered to life, they didn't show the rehearsed charity montage Gisaine had spent months preparing. Instead, the ballroom was flooded with the raw, clinical data recovered from the silk cage choker. The room fell into a silence so absolute it felt like the air itself had been sucked out. Then, the audio began. It was my mother's voice, crisp, cold, and utterly unmistakable, echoing through the high rafters. "Calantha isn't a daughter. She's an asset. If we can't break her mind with the sedatives, we'll sell her body to Sterling. It's the only way to save the Fairchild name from the audit." Then Casey's voice followed, clinical and detached, discussing the dosage required to keep me compliant on stage. Every whispered conspiracy, every jagged plan to erase my existence for the sake of a bank balance, was now being broadcast to the very people they had tried so hard to impress. I stood perfectly still on that stage, my shadow stretching long and dark across the screens. I had taken the very device they intended for my enslavement and turned it into the mirror that reflected their own ugliness. The socialites stared, their mouths agape, as the facade of the perfect Fairchild family shattered into a million irreparable shards. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its boots. But once the truth arrives, there is nowhere left for the lie to hide. "You were told I was hoarsely clinging to a fantasy," I said, my voice carrying over the audio of their betrayal. You were told I was broken, that my service was just a layer of paint to hide the rust. But the only thing delusional in this room was the belief that you could ever truly own a soul that belongs to the country. Gisaine slumped into a chair, her diamonds refracting the light of her own downfall. She looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see a mother or an enemy. I saw a hollow shell. Casey and Jody stood frozen, their faces ashen as the Naval Military Police moved in. The rhythmic clinking of silver handcuffs against their black silk gowns provided a new, final soundtrack for the night. Admiral Vance stepped beside me, his presence a solid wall of ice. I reached into the bodice of my gown and produced my father's true, last will and testament, the digital document finally unlocked by the Iron Widow encryption key. I didn't need a lawyer to explain the weight of what happened next. Under federal military law, the Espionage Act and RICO statutes, the entire Fairchild estate was being seized as the proceeds of treason and financial fraud. But I wasn't done. As the sole legal executor, I took the electronic pen from Vance's aide. With a steady hand, I signed the transfer papers. I didn't keep a single cent of the $500 million empire. Every acre of land, every drop of oil, and every dollar in those offshore accounts was moved into a non-profit trust dedicated to the families of fallen special operators. The Fairchild name was gone, replaced by a legacy of service. As Casey and Jody were led toward the exits, their eyes wide with the terror of people who had never faced a consequence they couldn't buy, I intercepted them. I didn't mock them. I didn't scream. I looked at my sisters with a quiet, heartbreaking grace that made Jody flinch. I hope one day you find a value in yourselves that doesn't require a price tag, I whispered. I've paid the Fairchild debts in full tonight, not with the money you craved, but with the honor you threw away. You're free now. Free to find out who you are when you aren't pretending. I turned back to the Admiral. I made sure my mother was placed under medical supervision rather than being tossed into a cell immediately. My iron shell was forged in fire, but it still held a daughter's compassion. Even in the height of justice, you must never lose your humanity. The air on the rooftop of the Post Oak Hotel was cool and carried the scent of a coming Texas dawn. I had stripped off the black silk gown, standing now in my tactical gear, the city of Houston sprawling beneath me like a map of a life I no longer needed to lead. The lights of the skyline were beginning to pale against the first gray streaks of morning. Admiral Vance met me by the black rotors of the waiting Apache helicopter. The engine was already warming up, a low, guttural thrum that felt like home. He looked at me, his eyes full of a respect that went beyond rank. The Fairchild name could be yours to rebuild, Calantha, he said. You've won. You could have it all. I looked out at the horizon, where the sun was just starting to burn through the haze. I shook my head. I thought of the long years in the dark, the weight of the paint, and the strength it took to keep the steel from rusting. Peace isn't the end of the war, Silas, I said, my voice steady against the wind. It's the moment you stop fighting the people who were never on your side to begin with. I'm not a Fairchild. I'm the Iron Widow. And my family is waiting for me in the sky. I took my father's old, empty locket from around my neck. It was the last physical tie to this place. I tossed it into the wind, watching it disappear into the darkness below. It was a final act of letting go. I stepped into the cockpit of the Apache. As the helicopter lifted, tilting its nose toward the rising sun, the camera caught the black paint of the machine gun, gleaming with a fierce, quiet power. Calantha watched the Fairchild Manor shrink into a tiny dot as the Apache turned toward the horizon. I know many of you watching this have felt underestimated. You've been treated like just a layer of paint, something meant to be used, mocked, or ignored. But remember this, steel doesn't need to scream to be strong. The most formidable warriors are the ones who know exactly when to walk away from a battle that isn't worth their heart. Have you ever found the strength to choose your own peace over someone else's drama? Tell me your story below. I read everyone.